Hello and welcome to episode 2 of your weekly dose of creativity. This week I've invited Rachel onto the podcast to discuss all things sales and launching. She's a sales and launch strategist known for her creativity whilst marketing her launches and creating some fantastic launch welcome charts, some that I've not seen anyone else even be close to replicating. And she's now made it her mission to help you do the same. So without further ado, let's get into it. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
I'm very, very excited about this one.
Exciting.
Launching and stuff is something that I am not amazing at and need to get better at. And I feel like you are the person to talk to about it. But before we get started properly, I ask each of my guests to give me a question for the next guest.
Nice.
So that's something for you to think about before the end as well. But my question from Kirsty, who's my last guest, if you were to do a TED Talk, what topic would it be on and why?
That's a good one. We actually were chatting about this. I was on Alice Benham's retreat last week and we literally were talking about this. So I'm well prepared for this question.
Amazing.
But yeah, I think for me, it would have to be something around immersive launching. So obviously launching is my bag, but specifically immersive, creative launches that feel like they're everywhere and they're taking over the internet. That would be my topic.
Okay, and then going into that, then you've touched on it a little bit, but if someone were to say like immersive launching, and what exactly does that mean for you, and what are your steps for creating a launch that is as immersive as you want it to be?
So yeah, I would say the difference between a launch and an immersive launch is like an immersive launch is basically, I say it takes over the internet, but it's that feeling of when you see something everywhere. A good example that I'm using at the moment, just because it's current, but this might date this podcast a little bit, is like the launch of Wicked, for example. Obviously, you know, I work with service-based businesses mostly, so it's a bit of a weird analogy to use like a film launch, but I think it works really well. Like when Wicked was like first out or it was coming up to be released in the cinema, wasn't it just like everywhere? Like you couldn't move.
You couldn't get away from it.
Yeah, it was just like Wicked is everywhere. It's in the shops. It's in our feeds. It's like there's collaborations all over the place. It's, you know, it's on the tube. It was just everywhere. And it also was everywhere in a way that it wasn't just in the format. Like for a film, you know, a lot of the time you see the trailer, maybe you see the trailer in the cinema, maybe you see it like advertised a bit, maybe you see like a billboard, and that's kind of it. Like you see some TV stuff and you don't really, it doesn't have quite the same level of multimedia takeover. And I think that is what I'm really, really talking about. And I don't mean that we all need I actually checked how much the budget was for marketing. I think it's around the like 350 million mark. Just for marketing.
Yeah.
So obviously we don't all have that at our disposal, but I do think that we can immerse our audiences in multiple formats, in different messaging, in different content types. We can speak to the different buyers in our audience. And most importantly, we can launch in a way that feels like us and feels really creative and fun and like a creative project. Like that's really what I want to get across with immersive launching, is that you can sell whatever you're selling in a way that like really inspires people and gets people to like really put your offering on their vision board. So big picture, that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, and if someone was like, right, I'm launching this in a few months' time, I have no plan for launching it, what would be your advice for A, planning the launch, but B, also helping them get creative and actually enjoying the launch?
Love that. Yeah, so I would say the bit that so many like either first time launchers or people who've launched before and it's like kind of mixed results, the bit that's often lacking with almost everyone I've worked with is the pre-launch. So it is just not building enough hype before the doors or metaphorical doors open. So I would say like really, really focusing on that hype building period is super important. And I can come back to that in a minute because there's a lot to say about that.
Yeah, no, do.
But in terms of planning it, I have a framework that I use inside my Luminous launching program, which is called the Beam framework. All the imagery around this program is all like light and like otherworldly. Like it's all very sort of like the brief I gave lovely Isa, who's branding it for me, was like kind of like alien worlds.
But it all works so well. Like your new branding, like you say, from the pictures to the colours, it's just light and stuff like that.
I think that's another thing. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad. I think that's another thing with, again, like launching and just brand in general. I think like world building is such a massive thing at the moment. So that's another thing I can come back to after I've talked about the Beam. I'm getting excited. There's too many things to talk about. So this Beam framework, this is how I plan my launches. So it's a 4-step process for like your launch, 4 phases. B is build. So I would say you are in build mode for your next launch, basically any time you're not in a launch. So if you're not launching, you are likely in your build phase. And build just means building your audience so that you've got, there's that phrase, isn't there, of you don't want to be always fishing from the same pond. So your build phase, you're building your pond, basically. You're building your pond that you want to fish from. So you're also in that time building, your plans for your launch, you're getting prepared. And I say this as someone who is often, working last minute. I think you don't necessarily have to be a super organized person to have a successful launch. But if you can get as much prepped in your build phase as possible, that's great. So that's build. The next one is E, which is engage. And that is the time where you want to be like teasing that something's coming. You want to maybe start potentially building a wait list. Like a wait list is really, really important to have a successful launch, just because you want to see like if people are interested, firstly. And it also helps build some of that hype. And you also want to be really talking about the topic that you are launching around. Like you want to really, really like, again, immerse people in the topic that you're going to be launching for in your engage phase. Next, we have A, which is anticipate. And that is where you really want to start building your hype. So maybe in this phase, you might run some sort of launch event, like a challenge or a webinar, if that's the kind of thing you're doing. Or maybe it's like an email series, like loads of different things you can do here. But you want to really be driving people to the wait list. You want to be like on message. This is your like pre-launch. Maybe it's the couple of weeks before. You are building anticipation. So that's anticipate. And then the M in Beam is market, which is basically selling time. That's when your cart is open. You're selling to all the different types of people in your audience. You're selling in lots of different and creative ways. And you're basically showing up for your cart open phase. So that's how I plan the launch. Did that answer your question? I feel like there was another part of it.
But I can't remember what the other part was, if there is another part. But
we'll get back to it, I'm sure.
But based on that Beam method, what content would you be looking to be putting out there in the world? But also you talk about like a multi-channel, like multi-world method. So presumably that is not just social media, it's in person, it's email, stuff like that. So how do you create your content to then tie it all in together?
So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be taking it across like every single platform. I think you can have an immersive launch by just using, email and Instagram, for example. It's great if you can be in other places, but you don't have to like spread yourself super thin, especially if you don't have audiences in other places. But you can definitely, let's say if you were using, well, for me, my highest converting platform is always email. And for anyone I work with on their launches, I will always suggest that they use email as like that's their conversion place. Even if they don't have an email list yet, you can start an email list before a launch. Like you don't have to have an active email list before, because you can build that wait list.
Okay.
But that is always where I like almost think about, that's like the hub of where all my content is going to go. Firstly is like emails. And that is weird to say because I'm not really an email girly traditionally. Like I'm very visual. I like video content. Like I prefer to sort of like chat live. Like I love podcasts, like It's not really my preferred format, but it is the highest converting. So it is something that I have embraced as someone who loves to launch. But then I tend to start with like thinking about what are the key messages that I want to get across that are going to help someone know all the things that they need to know to make a decision to buy from me. So I start with the email, like the email series, I guess. And I think like, okay, what are all the messages I need to get across to help someone know what they need to know? And I also like to think of how are the different ways I can share this so that it's going to appeal to different types of buyers? Because not everyone buys in the same way. Like some people need loads of detail. They need to know all the specifics. Some people need like to hear the transformation and be like really inspired. Some people need evidence. Some people need to like see case studies. So that's another way to like really be immersive in your content, is to share the things that you need to share from lots of different angles. Because the temptation is sometimes just to say the same thing over and over again. And we do need to be repetitive in a certain sense, because not everyone sees everything and it takes a while for messages to get through. But we do want to cover things from different perspectives. So that is always where I will start, is work out like what content and what messages I want to share. It's something I actually call the content lighting grid, like the messaging lighting grid.
Okay.
Because if you think about, again, to use my like lighting analogy, if you think about your offer, you want to light it up as much as you can. And the way to light it up is that you want to have lots of different lights on it. If you just have one light just focused on the front, it's going to be very flat. It's going to be very like 2D image. If you light it from all different angles, it's going to be lit up in a much more kind of dynamic and 3D way. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with like this content lighting grid. Does that make sense so far?
The photographer, it makes loads of sense to me. So I think it should make sense because, like you say, it's coming from all angles. It's not just from one. And what content would you be then looking to, particularly like in the build phase? Because obviously you described that as like you're building your pods. You may not even have anything to launch yet, but you know it might be around a certain topic. Is there anything specific that you'd be looking to post within that phase?
So I would say in the build phase, you are also building your reputation. So I would say this is like where you want to go into sort of super nurturing mode. So you want to be sharing value around the topic. So I guess let's use me as an example. I was in the build phase. I'm right now, as we're chatting, I'm sort of just coming into my like engage phase for my Luminous launching launch. So I've been in build for the last few months. And I've been sharing things like 2025 sales and launch trends. I did a trend report that I spoke a lot about. I also created a private podcast that was all about launching. And I'm not necessarily making a direct sales pitch, but I am really solidifying myself in the topic of launching, because I know I'm about to go into my Luminous launch. That's a lot of the word launch inception. But yeah, anything that is like really building your reputation in the area of expertise that you want to be known for. So it can look like education, it can look like opinions, it can even be similar sorts of stuff that you would talk about in your launch. But, you know, you can either send people to a freebie or a wait list. You're basically just like, what do you need to do to build your expertise, build your reputation in this area of expertise?
Yeah, I guess as well, you're like, say that you're pointing them towards a freebie or something like that. You're also then building that email list ready to then convert as well. So you're building everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then when it comes to selling, what would your advice be for someone who typically feels really icky about selling, doesn't necessarily enjoy it, finds it a little bit daunting, but knows they have to do it?
Yeah, I think, you know, it is a skill that needs to be built. And I think that's the key thing to remember, is that you're not born good or bad at selling. It's something that can be practiced and embraced, I guess. And I think that I would honestly, I know it's easier said than done, but I would think of selling as like a creative act, and think of all the fun ways that you can share the information about your offer. And I think if you're feeling icky about selling, I would definitely try and investigate where that's coming from and why that is, because when you're selling, all you're doing is sharing information about something that could potentially help someone. You're not knocking on their door and being like, please help me, I need your money. You are sharing information about something really cool that you've made, and they will probably enjoy if it's right for them. Like, it's something that they will get a lot out of if they are the right person for your offer. So all you're doing is sharing the information in lots of ways. And there are so many ways to sell from a place of values. And the more information you share about your offer, actually, the more you're helping someone make a decision. So I think it's just separating that feeling of selling from I'm pestering people to just you're sharing information. You don't have to sell in a pressured way. Like, all you're doing is just sharing how cool your offer is. And I think, there's obviously a lot of confidence stuff there as well, of like being confident in your offer and knowing that it is something that will help people. But I think, again, it's finding ways of doing it where you feel like you're selling as you. And I think this is where like the immersive launching thing comes in, and the creativity comes into this. Because I know sometimes people might hear like a launch that feels like it's everywhere and be a bit like, oh, I'm not sure if I want to be everywhere, actually. That feels a bit scary. I know I would have felt like that a few years ago, but like, it doesn't mean that you have to be everywhere, like shouting and, like just, again, like bothering people. It's more that you're putting so much love and creativity and energy and genuine authenticity into your launch that people are just really interested in what you're doing. Like, I've really noticed in the past few years, there are people in my audience who've never bought anything from me, but they often say like, oh, I just love watching you launch. And even the people who don't buy are going to be inspired by your launch. So I think it's just accepting that that selling is helping people, even if they don't buy. I think that can help as well.
And your launches particularly, it always feels so inclusive. Like, with the way you do like the launch charts, and then people are joining and you add more. So like, my favorite one was from your Pinterest course, your latest one, with like the rocket and stuff like that. It just looked so cool. It's far more creative than I'd go with a lot. Like, but and people almost get that FOMO, and they're like, oh, but I want to be on that list because it looks so cool. And then it brings them in further, which is always really and it gets everyone else feeling creative as well, because they go, well, what could we do with our marketing or launching? Talking of launches that you've done for your own business, what would be your favorite one to date, and why?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I feel like, so I mentioned the private podcast that I did a couple of months ago. I talked in one of the episodes in that about my first launch that I ever did, and then my best financial launch. And I think it's really hard to decide between those two, because my first launch was so exciting, and I think it just went so much better than I ever expected. And I think it's probably where I suddenly thought like, oh, actually, maybe this is something that I'm good at in terms of launching. Like, it's just something where I found a lot of joy and fun. So that, I think, but then also because it was the first time I did it, obviously I didn't really have that much of a strong strategy. It was a bit chaotic. It was quite stressful because I was doing everything for the first time. So maybe my favorite one, and also my most successful one, would have been, again, you mentioned my Pinterest course. That was, until sort of the last 6 months or so, that was very much my signature offer. And there was I think it was 2022. I basically just I called it the unicorn launch, because it just converted like nothing I'd ever sold before. It just obviously hit a really, really sort of key moment in time. Or the wait list was really, really strong. There was just, everything just seemed to work. And it's actually the first time I brought the paper rocket thing in. So I've always done launch charts, but I started really turning them into like installations. And it just felt like, I think that's the first time I felt like I had a system that was repeatable. I actually repurposed 75% of the content that I'd done before. So it felt really easy. Like, it was the first launch where I was like, there was almost points when I was like, I feel like I'm not working enough.
Yeah.
which was my own mindset stuff. But I was like, I feel like I should be doing more, but I'm not. But it feels really easy because I'm just using this strategy that I've done a few times. And yeah, I mean, that ended up being a 30K launch, which is like more, that's more money than I made in an entire year in my like first couple of years of business.
Yeah.
So it's not all about that, it's not all about those big numbers necessarily, but like I think that the reason why it was my favorite is because I just felt so much ease. And because of the ease that I'd built with a strategy that is repeatable, I was then able to have so much more fun with it in the extra time that I had. So, for example, building a paper rocket and hanging it up in my studio and adding the names to it as people joined. The reason I have time to do that kind of thing is because I've got a really solid strategy now that looks after the stuff that needs to happen in the background. Otherwise, I wouldn't have time to have that creativity in my content because I'd be so busy doing all the moving parts behind the scenes.
And I feel like as well, the more fun you're having with the content, the more it brings people into it as well.
Yeah. People feel it. People can feel your energy when you're selling at 100%. And I think your way of like selling with creativity and fun doesn't have to look like mine. I think that's the key thing as well. It's like there will be people who are like, there's no way I'm going to spend a whole day creating a paper installation. That's something that I just find fun. And that's why it works, is because I find that really fun and people get excited with me. But there will be countless other versions of what that looks like for other people. And I think when you hit on something that feels very like your world, that's when it really works and people get excited by it. And that's when they start to feel immersed in it.
Yeah. You talked about as well how that launch for Ignite in 22, whenever it was, you repurposed like 75% of the content. What would your advice be to repurpose the content in a way that still feels different and still feels new? Because obviously you don't want to feel like you don't want people feeling like, oh, I think I've seen this before. You're using it to drive excitement. You're using it to make your life easier, but give you a better launch. So how do you go about doing that?
Well, I might shock you here, but loads of it I use just as it is.
Oh, wow.
Loads of it. And in fact, the emails, for example, I will obviously also, like I do very much like a sort of structured launch debrief after I launch. I look at the content that's performed well. I look at the emails that converted. I look at all those things and like gather the data. So that's why it's only like 75% of the content, because some of it just doesn't hit. And also some of it won't be as relevant. So I also want to make sure that the launch is like speaking to where people are at now. So it's not a word for word copy ever. Like there's always stuff that needs tweaking. But especially if I think about like the messaging, the emails, and some of the Instagram in fact, loads of the Instagram content, I just update little bits, dates, anything that needs updating. A lot of it was carbon copy. And I think that that's a really, really important thing to share, because I think so many of us are so worried about being repetitive and repeating ourselves and being boring that we make our lives way more difficult than they need to be. And I had people so I always ran a free challenge that went with this particular program called the Spark. It was really popular, always got lots of signups, people really enjoyed it. I ran that in exactly the same way for 4 years. Like I even used the same videos, the same emails, and I had people who joined 4 years in a row. I haven't had one single message or email from people. No one has said to me, stop saying the same thing over and over again or something similar. Maybe I'm not saying that no one's noticed. Like I'm sure people might have noticed, but also sometimes if you think about it, how much content do you see every day? It's often 6 months ago that I've shared this content. There's nothing wrong with repeating yourself. And in fact, it's needed, because people don't take all the information in. They don't think like, oh, I've read that before. There's actually comfort in repetition. And if you've got your content, like, I was saying the messaging lighting grid, if you've got that set up well and it converts, why not use it over and over again, as long as it's still relevant? So yeah, that's my answer to that, is that you don't need to be as, you don't need to reinvent the wheel with some of it. And then I think, let's say 70%, 75%, if you've got to a stage where you can repurpose that amount of content, that last 25% is where you bring the creativity and freshness in. And then it feels like the whole thing is really fresh, because you've got that like sprinkle on top of new, fresh ideas and relevance, and like that's where your creativity can come in, and that makes the whole thing feel fresh, but actually the backbone is all repeatable.
Yeah. And how do you then, so you talk about like an end of launch debrief, looking at what worked and what didn't, but during the launch and through the stage, particularly stages of the launch where you're building the hype, you're building the wait list, and then it comes to like selling, what would your advice be in terms of knowing when it's time to adapt the plan because it's not converting as much as you need it to convert?
Yes, I love that. So I would say I don't want to say never, but I will rarely adapt the plan massively in the car open phase, because by that point, I should know how it's going to go, because at a certain point, launching is kind of just maths in terms of I usually have a way of working out my launch goals in terms of how many people I need on my email list to get to around about my launch goals. And that's because I know usually, again, sometimes when you're launching something new, this is always a little bit more guesswork. But with something like Ignite, for example, something that I launched over and over and over again, I knew that my conversion rate was usually anywhere between 5 and 10%. So that means like however many people I had on my wait list, between 5 and 10% of those people would buy. And then that's, at that point, it's just maths. So I would work out, okay, if I want 50 people to join, then, I'm not going to be able to do this maths off the top of my head, but I can basically work out how, let's say 10% because it's easier.
Yeah.
I need 500 people on my email list. And then I'd usually make my guess a little bit less than that, because I would usually work it out on 5%, because you want to be a little bit more conservative with your estimates, just because then you can be pleasantly surprised. But so I would work it out if I knew, okay, it's my launch is next week and I have 10 people on my wait list, I'm going to struggle. Like I already know before I've opened the doors. If it gets to open doors and something isn't converting, then usually it'll be because the messaging is wrong or the offer's wrong. So I've had launches that have completely flopped, and it's because I have, there'll be an offer that I have that people just don't understand or they don't need. Like often that will happen. I've launched a few different things in the past where it was like something that I wanted to do, but people didn't really need. It didn't have that like juicy, people didn't really want it. But even in those launches, I would probably know, like I would have an idea because of like what had happened. Like my launch spidey senses would be tingling and I'd be like, I'm not sure if this is going to go the way I want it to. But I will always keep going until the end and keep the plan, because you never know how a launch is going to go until you get to the end. So this is why it's really, really important not to just like panic in the middle of a launch and think like, oh, it's not working, I need to adjust the plan. Because if I could share my like launch graphs with you to show you what my sales pattern usually looks like, I usually will have a little flurry of people on the first day. Let's say it's a week-long launch. I'll have a little flurry on the first day, then maybe a couple more in the next couple of days. Then I will have probably 3 or 4 days with no one buys and it's completely dead, like nothing happens. And then 2 hours before the doors close, I will have
everyone's buying.
Everyone, like literally with every single one of my launches, it's been like between 70 and like 85% of people have bought in the last 2 hours. Now, if you panic in that bit in the middle and you think my launch isn't working and you change your plans, it could have been a really good launch. Like for example, my 30K launch, if I'd have given up in the middle, or if I'd have changed my plans and panicked and made loads of panicky changes, then I wouldn't have known that 78% or something, whatever it was, of people who contributed to that 30K launch were going to come in the last 2 hours. So who knows what it would have been. But you kind of have to commit at a certain point once you get into that doors open. You can always think on the fly and like add little things in, but I wouldn't start like retracting or, like extending the deadline by loads, or, you kind of have to trust the process at some point. If to really like get the data, I guess, because otherwise if you keep changing things, you're never going to know what the data actually is, because you're kind of basing it on not true fact.
Yeah. And I feel like as well, you're not the first person I've heard say that during a launch period, you get that middle bit that is just stagnant, and it can be so easy to go, well, it's not working. But actually that last day, people are waiting to almost decide. And it's like that fear of missing out when you realize that you've got that short window left to be able to buy and go, actually, no, I do need this service. I do need to do it. What then do you do? So the launches you've had that haven't worked as well as you wanted them to work, what have you done to pick yourself back up, not let it knock your confidence, and keep your confidence for the next launch? Because obviously that's really important as well, because not every launch is going to work.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is hard. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say that I am immune to confidence wobbles, because that would be a big old lie. But I think it's just trying as hard as you can to see it as data, because it is data. And, you know, it is often really sad. You know, I've retired programs that I absolutely loved because the data was telling me that people just didn't want this offer in this form. Like, there are things that I loved teaching that just weren't what the market needed at that time. So I guess it's like trusting the data and making changes accordingly. Or sometimes it's not, you know, if a launch has flopped, it doesn't necessarily mean that the offer's wrong. Like, sometimes you just haven't hit the messaging. So I think that's the thing. It's like, allow yourself to be a bit sad, like allow the launch hangover. That's the thing. You get to have a few days of, like, I call it, like, I'll have a little mope after my launch, and you're allowed to do that. That is fine. You're not weird for, like, having a confidence wobble after a failed launch. Allow that to be the case, and then dive into the data and see, like, where did it go wrong? Like, what was it? Was it the messaging? Is it a proven offer that you know people want? And if it is, usually it will be one of two things. It will be either the messaging, as in, like, you've not said what you need to say to get people to see the value, or it will be that you just didn't show up enough. Like, usually those are the two things. Very occasionally it will also be that, like, the timing is off. Like, something massive might have just happened in the world and the internet is just talking about that thing, and it's just often, like, hard to sell in that kind of environment. Or, you know, there's lots of different things that it could be, but usually it will be either the messaging or you've not shown up enough. It'll be those two things, or the offer.
Yeah. And touching back on looking at the data and knowing whether or not it's time to stop offering something. When do you, like, for example, you stopped offering Ignite last year. It was last cohort. Having done it myself, it was really, really useful. I know lots of other people found that, and it seemed to still be quite hugely popular. How did you know that it was the right time to close the doors on what was the offer that seemingly was still working for you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, Ignite definitely isn't in the camp of things that weren't working. Like, Ignite, it was a wrench to let that go. Like, it really, and it still feels like scary. Like, so it was nothing to do with the offer. I know that it's a really good offer. I know people, the last cohort was amazing. People were getting, like, such great, in fact, classically, it was actually, people got almost the best results from that cohort than any of the other ones. It's a classic. I was literally like, this feedback I'm getting is honestly, like, really pulling me back in. But the reason that I have retired it is because it's like a bigger brand vision thing, really. Like, I have moved into a space where I am really, really committed to niching down and talking about launching and sales. And Pinterest, Pinterest is, like, sort of connected to sales because it is somewhere where you can sell your work. But because I have been, and this is like a kind of a catch-22 situation, because I've been so known in the last, like, five-ish years, because of these launches that I've done, because they were so immersive, and they did kind of have that feeling of, like, being everywhere a little bit, it really built a name for myself as a Pinterest marketing expert. So everyone was recommending me for Pinterest marketing, and it kind of became the only thing that people knew me for, even though I was doing lots of other things. And actually, the work that I was enjoying the most was talking about launching in particular. But because Pinterest was because I had done these launches, and because it had sort of put my name on the map, I guess, in terms of, like, Pinterest marketing, it was so hard to detach myself from that and put a focus somewhere else. And also another thing is just from a practical level, I started teaching Pinterest because I used to be a wedding stylist and it was a huge part of my wedding business. I've not run that wedding business for 5 years now. And although I do use Pinterest in my service-based business, like as in like for my marketing business, I wasn't using it as much because this business that I'm running now is so based on live launching. And the one thing that Pinterest isn't good with is live launching. It is an evergreen platform. It is like, and it's amazing. It's not that it's not good for marketing businesses. Like it is, it's an amazing tool. I am still using it. And as I do more evergreen stuff, I'll probably pick it up, pick it up more. But because I wasn't using it that much for my business, because I was doing all this live launching, I had this weird disconnect between what I was doing in my own business and what I was doing with clients in that program. And I am so passionate about being like the embodiment of what I'm teaching. And the less I was using Pinterest for me in my business now, the more I felt weird about running Pinterest programs, even though, like I said, that last cohort, the results they were getting were amazing. It just, the longer I had that program, even though it was working for me, even though I know, if I launched it again, like in the next month, I know I could have a really successful launch with it. It's holding on to that was stopping me moving into the direction that I want to move into in like a committed way.
Yeah.
So yeah, long answer to that. It was hard. It was a really hard decision, but in terms of like brand growth and going in the direction that I really want to go in, it had to go, and it was so sad.
Yeah, but like you say, it's the right time because you see where the brand's going and you just go, well, this just doesn't fit anymore, as hard as it might be to admit it.
It was the one thing when I looked at it, I think I was really struggling with clarity around my brand for so long of like what my thing was. And the reason it took me so long to like find my new direction is because I was always trying to squeeze Ignite into it. And it just didn't make sense with the big picture of live launching. So it was the thing that was like holding me back, really.
Going back to the live launching again, because there's so many Pinterest questions that I could ask you, but based on your answer before, I'm not going to ask you them because launching in Pinterest. Your work is predominantly with service-based business owners. But say you had a product-based business owner come to you saying, I need help with launching. Would the way you help them and would the advice you give be any different?
I've asked this question to myself a lot because I have so many past clients who are product sellers. And it was actually a really tough part of my rebranding because I was like, I feel like I'm cutting off this huge, client base by saying that I'm mainly working with service providers. But also I do think it is really important to like have the right thing for the right people. So I would say it can absolutely work. Loads of it works for everyone, like having your messaging lighting grid, for all your different products is always going to help. Building your audience, being in the build phase, even like the whole beam process can work. But I would say it depends on the way that they tend to sell their products. If they sell on like an evergreen daily sales basis where like, they will like, I guess, introduce a new product and then it's just on sale and, they're selling all their whole product line, they're selling all the time. Sometimes you don't really need that launch process because it doesn't really fit with the way that you sell. But there are people I know who, for example, maybe they're running a Kickstarter. I did actually have, Sarah from These Are the Days, she's actually a brand designer, but she was launching a product and she joined Luminous Launching. She was doing a Kickstarter. Now, that is an example where my framework for launching works perfectly for a product because it's one thing and you are talking about it for an extended period of time and it is like a finite live launch in that sense. So that's an example where like absolutely it all applies. But I think the places where it's like slightly trickier is if you have like a full collection or your launch for your products is just that you have a new product to share. There are lots of principles that are the same, but the way that I tend to work is in it's a launch period where you're going to be talking about something for a finite amount of time. You're going to be talking about it a lot and it has a beginning and end point. So yeah, the answer is it really depends on like the way that you sell products. But for some product sellers, absolutely, especially if it's like maybe they've got one thing that they're, or one collection or something, and they're going to have like a really like finite amount of time where they're just going to be selling it, then yeah, it can work. But I think it applies more seamlessly, I guess, to service providers who are selling, you know, something like a program or a one-to-one offer, or something that kind of like has a beginning and end point.
That was going to be my next question, was does it differentiate in terms of service providers between those that offer like the one-to-one or coaching or the mentoring to someone who says like me, who might offer photo shoots throughout the year, who doesn't really have a beginning and end because they're just like constantly available? But you've just answered that.
Well, there is a kind of way of building that beginning and end point in, because like so I mentioned Isa earlier, who did my whole rebrand. She is also in my mastermind, so we're like clients of each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And her branding services are always on all the time. Like you can book in with her to do a branding sprint. As long as she has availability, you can book in with her whenever. But she runs launches as part of her sales, you know, system, because she has different offers that she wants to like shine the spotlight on at different times. So she will have, you know, she's actually going into a launch in the next couple of weeks where she's talking about something called the offer oven. So she has a very specific, she goes through the whole Beam framework and she talks about that offer, and she does it as a launch. Because basically a launch is just, you're talking about something specific in a specific amount of time, and you're talking about it a lot. That's all a launch is, really. You're just talking about something loads. But she'll use something like an expiring offer, or like there'll be like a bonus for a certain amount of time, even though it can be any time. So for your photography, let's say you could run, maybe they're good, like at a certain times of the year you offer it at a special bulk price, or maybe they get an extra, I don't know, maybe they get like an extra album or something. You can use that timed thing to build a launch framework around stuff that's available all the time. So it absolutely can work for stuff that's available all the time. But because, again, it's easier to do that with services than it is with products, because often with your products, you want to be selling all of your product range a lot of the time, all the time. So it's not so much like what do you sell, it's like how do you want to sell it, and does that fit in well with like a launch campaign setup. You can kind of make a launch campaign about anything as long as it fits your business model, really.
Interesting. I feel like that's almost a nice place to leave it. My last question to you from me will be, what's your favourite part of launching?
Good question. I think sort of broken record, really, but I think it is just how creative it can be. I love thinking about the launch as, in fact, actually, this is really my favourite bit. And it's something that I have always thought about, probably because I have a background in styling and I'm, I was trained as a set designer. It's just where my brain goes naturally. But world building is like a huge trend at the moment. And that's basically like building a world around your offer and around your brand. And that being such a huge trend right now, it just appeals to me so much, because I love like the ideas phase where you're like, okay, what's the theme going to be for this launch? And like, what does that mean for my content? And what does it mean for the branding? And like, how can I bring that theme? Like I was saying, the theme for Luminous launching is like this sort of other world, like portals to another dimension, like vibe. And I'm like, oh, so what does that mean for my launch chart? Like, am I going to make a UFO with like a beam coming out of it? Like all that stuff. It is so fun because you get to be like the director of your own like media company, basically. That's social media for me in general, or having an online presence. You are literally like, it's like having your own TV channel. So like, how are you going to make it fun? Like, how are you going to share those messages in a fun and exciting way? Like, if someone came to you, I mean, maybe this is the only thing that I find fun, but like, if someone came to you and said like, okay, we're going to give you the keys, or like, we're going to give you the reins to this like marketing campaign, and you get to do it however you like. You get to be as creative as you want with it. Like for me, I'm like, that sounds so fun.
I feel like that for some people, that's also quite dangerous. Because I know with me, I'd go, right then, let's get going.
Bring that energy. Like, right then, let's get going. How can you bring that to your own marketing? Like, I think that's what, why not? Why not do it in a fun way?
At the end of the day, what have you got to lose? You don't make any sales, but if you're not doing it, you're not making sales anyway.
Exactly. Exactly. And people can feel that energy. People can feel when you're having fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to end it there. So before we sign off, I'm not going to tell you who my next guest is, but what question are you wanting to ask them?
Yes, I should have been thinking about this while we were chatting. Well, maybe to keep it on theme with what we're talking about, where in their business could they be having more fun that they're not currently?
I really, really like that question.
Good. I'm glad.
And I know my next guest is going to like that as well.
Good. I'm glad. Say hello to them from me.
Yeah, will do. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. If someone wants to find you online, start following you, are interested in joining Luminous Launching, where can they find you?
Well, thanks so much for having me. I've absolutely loved this. So you can find me. All of my handles are basically Rachel Emma Waring. Waring is spelled Waring. And I would say best place to go is, you can probably find this either in my most recent like pinned post on Instagram or in my link in bio. I've got a trio of freebies at the moment that's all about launching. I mentioned one of them earlier, the 2025 sales and launch trends. That also comes with like a mini masterclass. So that talks a lot about launching and like how to bring in some of that world building and like immersive marketing, like all of those big trends that are happening this year. And then when you sign up for that, you'll also get a link to my private podcast, which is also free. And that also talks about immersive launching. And then all of that basically is leading up to my Luminous Launching launch. So if you get those freebies, you'll hear about Luminous Launching eventually.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I've loved this.